Hello guys, my name is Kole Ochai and I'm here to give a step-by-step explanation to how to use Simplex method to solve the LP problem. Now, this is similar to what we did in production management, I think a few years back, right? However, there are some certain steps, right, that are different from what we did back then. So the first thing first, we're going to start. Now, the first step to follow is that you would introduce what we call slack variables, right? And the point of introducing slack variables is to what? To change inequality. What do we mean by inequality? This is the inequality sign. To change inequality to what? Equality, right? To equality, right? So this is the first step that you take. Now, to effect this step into the question, you go about it like this: 3x1 plus 5x2 plus 4x3, right? Plus 0x1 plus 0x2 plus 0x3, right? Okay. Now, this is subject to the constraint. Subject to the constraint. The constraints are what? The first constraint is 2x1 plus 3x2 plus x1. Your slack variable x1 it will no longer be less than or equal to, but rather equal to, because we have used the slack variable to change inequality to equality. So it will be equals to what? 8. And then the second one will be 2x2 plus 5x3 plus x2, which will be equals to what? 10. And then the third one will be 3x1 plus 2x2 plus 4x3 plus x3 to be equals to what? 15. And then don't forget your non-negativity function, which is what? x1, x2, x3, x1, x2, x3, right? Now, you can see that all the equality sign changed except the non-negativity constraint. It did not change. It's left over like that. So something else to note is that for the objective function, the coefficient of the x1, which is your slack variables, they are all what? 0 and 0, except when you come to this to the constraints. Now the coefficients are 1, 1 and 1. So you make sure you take note of these differences. Okay, so moving on to step 2. So for step 2, you have to calculate z, zj, and what? Cj minus zj values. These are the things that you are supposed to do. You calculate the z value, the zj value, and your cj minus zj values. Now these are very important values that would determine what is optimal and what is not optimal, right? So now, but before you go ahead with this, you have to do a first or your initial solution. So you go to a separate sheet, right? You go to a separate sheet, right? And then you put your step 3 now. Your step 3 will now be what? Initial solution, right? Okay. So now you bring your columns and your rows. You say profit per unit. Profit per unit, that is CB, right? Draw a line, right? And then the next one will be what? Variables in basic. Variables in basic. And then you draw a line. Then bring your solution values, then you draw a line, right? And then you start to bring your decision variables, right? Which is x1, x1, x2, right? x3, right? And then s1, s2, x3, and then your minimum ratio, right? And then you start to do your row lines. Okay, okay, right, right, okay. So having so now by doing this now this profit per unit is usually zero, right? For the first initial solution, you make it 0 and 0 and 0. It's when we now solve to a point, then you now start replacing it. We'll get there, then you get to see what I'm talking about. So profit per unit will be 0 and 0 and 0. And then the variables in basic, what this means is the variables in basic means is referring to your slack variables, right? Which is your x1, your x2, and your x3. You are simply just indicating it, right? Then your solution values refers to this. Now look at the values that are on the right hand side of the constraint. From my perspective, the right hand side of the constraint, which is 8, 10, and 15, that will now be your what? Your solution values, 8, 10, and 15. Then now for your x1 now, you go to your constraint, 2x1, right? So 2 is for x1, x2, 3 is for x2. There's no x3, so it will be 0. And then x1 is 1. There's no x2, so it will be 0. There's no x3, it will be 0. You move on to the next. Here is 2. Look at, they say 2x2, that means there's no x1. So x1 will be 0, 2x2 will be 2. Here will be what? X3 will be what? 5. And then there's no x1, so x1 will be 0. There's x2, 1. And then here will be what? 0. You do the same thing for here. 2, 3x1, that's x1 is 3, 2x2, here will be 2, then x3 is what? 4, right? And then there's no x1, there's no x2, there's an x3, right? So now you leave this column blank for the meantime. So we have to calculate our z value here. We are now to calculate our zj value here, and then calculate our cj minus zj value, right? So this is how it is. Don't overthink it, just get the structure and just start working on the structure, right? So now moving back to our step 2, after we have constructed this, we'll now go back to our step 2, where we say calculate z, zj, and c. So to calculate your z, the formula is what? Basic coefficient variables, right? Basic coefficient variables, right? Times what? Your basic variable values. Now this CB means what? Basic coefficient. So you just know where they are talking about. So that means that what? That is 0. 0 times what? Times the basic variable values. This is your solution values. That's what it means. So 0 times 8, right? Plus 0 times 10 plus 0 times 15, right? So we all know that the answer here is going to be what? 0, because 0 times all these things gives you 0. So you have gotten your z value to be what? 0. Then your zj, the formula for your zj is what? Basic coefficient what? Variables times what? Times the jth column of what? Data matrix, right? Data matrix. What it means is that we know what our basic coefficient variable means. This one's here, right? Then to now get your jth column of data matrix, the way you get it is, now this is a, b, c, d, e, f, g, h, I, then this is your j, right? So if this represents your J now, they're not talking about the Jth column, the J. So this is the J column bar, right? So that will be equals to, let's say our ZJ1, right? ZJ1 will be what? Basic coefficient variable will be 0. So 0 times what? Times what? The Jth column. So 0 times 2 plus what? Plus what? 0 times 0 plus 0 times 3, right? Then your ZJ2 will now be what? Your ZJ2 will now be what? So if you remove this column now, this column is not existing, assuming now it's not existing, then this now will now form your what? Your Jth column, just like how I did it. So ZJ2 will now be equals to what? 0 times what? 3 plus 0 times 2 plus 0 times 2 again, right? So for your ZJ, 3 will now be equals to what? So if these two columns are no longer existing, here will now be your J column. So you now bring your basic coefficient, which is 0, 0 times 0 plus 0 times 5 plus 0 times 4, right? So we all know that the answers here are all what? 0 and 0, right? Okay. So having established that 0, 0, 0, here we know that are definitely 0 and 0. So we are now going to look at your CJ minus your ZJ. What that means is that you are just looking, this one is direct, there's no formula, it's already stated for you. CJ minus ZJ. But what you have to keep in mind is that your CJ, right, represents your CJ value represents what? The values, the values in the objective function. Don't forget this, the values in the objective function. And what's your objective function? The objective function are those 3, 5, and 4. This is your objective function. So the values here are 3, 5, and 4. So that's what it means. So now, by your CJ minus ZJ, right, 1 will be what? 3 minus your ZJ1. So 3 minus 0 give you what? 0. And then CJ minus ZJ2 will now be what? 5 minus 0. So 5 minus 0 gives you what? 0. Then your CJ minus your ZJ3 will now be what? 4 minus 0. That will give you what? Sorry, I've made a mistake here. Sorry. So 3 minus 0 is 3, 5 minus 0 is 5, 4 minus 0 is what? 4. I was thinking it was a multiplication. So this is how you get this value, right? So you come here and you put it 3, 5, 4, and then 0, 0, and 0, right? Okay. Now, from this now, any value other than this, right, the CJ value is what? 0. So after you've covered for 3, 5, and 4, the rest of the values of CJ are what? All 0. Don't forget that. So having established your initial solution, the next thing is you pen down a note. So you see from the table above, right, the values from the table above, the values at CJ minus ZJ row is what? They are greater or equal to what? 0. Thus, the optimal solution has not been met. So now, this particular statement tells a lot. What it means is that at the end of the day, the point that you reach that you say that your solution is now on track, or the point that you reach that you say that you are done, is when the values here, they are what? They are 0 or they are less than 0. So long as a value here is greater than 0, you are not yet done. You keep on going for your solution, keep on creating these tables and the tables until you get your CJ minus ZJ row to 0 or less than 0. So moving on. So now we're not going to say that at the CJ minus ZJ row, it can be noted, or it can be seen that the highest positive the highest positive value is what? 5. Look at it now. The highest positive value is what? 5. Thus, right, x2 is the what? Is the key column. So after you've now determined that there's no, like, the values at the CJ and the ZJ row are greater than what? 0, you are now going to start working for your next solution. And how do you start by doing that? You start by doing that by figuring out where the key column is. And what do you look at when you are trying to determine what the key column is? You look at the values at the CJ minus ZJ row. Which of them is highest? The highest positive number. Now, if everything here was negative, you look for the highest negative number. But since everything here is positive, you say, give me the what? Highest positive number. So the highest positive number is here is 5. So this 5 becomes your key column. You can also call it your what? Your pivot column, right? And that column also is also called your what? You can also call this column, right, your incoming row. What this means is that this column will now replace this column, right? So this column is an incoming column. It is the key column, it is the pivot column, and it is the incoming row. It will replace this row. Don't worry, as we move on, you understand what I mean by it would replace it. So thus x2 is the key column slash the pivot column slash the incoming row. Okay, so now after you've determined, you can just simply indicate it here, key row, or maybe key, you can simply indicate at the top key column or pivot column, so as you will not forget. Then, as you have determined that, you can now start filling the side. How do you feel that? By determining that here is your key column, you're now going to look at your solution values, and you are going to divide your solution values by the row values of the key column. What do I mean? Look at the key column here. So now 8 will be divided by 3, right? 10 will be divided by 2, right? 15 will be divided by 2, right? So see how I've picked all the values at the key column to match the solution values, right? Okay, so that's how you get to fill that, right? You can see put here 0 and 0. So the incoming row now, moving down. So the next thing we have to determine, after we have determined the key column, we are now to find the key row. And how do we get the key row? You silently find, you silently do this division, right? You see 8 divided by 3. 8 divided by 3 is 2.6. Then 10 divided by 2 is 5, right? And then 15 divided by 2 is what? 15 divided by 2 is 7.5. So from everything here, we now know that 8 divided by 3 gives you the lowest value, 2.7. So since it gives you the lowest value, this now will now become what? Your key role. So now you say from the minimum ratio column, right? The exchange ratio with the lowest value is what? 8 all over 3, right? Thus, right? Um, thus, your x1 becomes what? Thus, x1 becomes the what? The key row, slash pivot row slash outgoing row, right? So what this means is this x1 would leave, and then this x2 will now come into this, right? So you have been able to determine that this is your key column and this is your key row, right? Make sure you remember this. So the next thing now is to determine your pivot element or your key element. And your key element refers to what? That value that is at the intersection of your key column and your key row. What does that mean? This is your key column. This is your key row. So the value that intersects, that is at the intersection of two of them, becomes your what? Your pivot element or your key element. And what value is that? 3. Because look at key column, key row, right? So this value intersects them, right? So then key element or pivot element is what? 3, right? So you've succeeded in forming your first solution. Now you are now going to do the workings in order to get the next solution, which is more improved. So now you are now going to go step 4. So step 4 will be what? You call it your what? Your first iteration. Your first iteration. Now you are going to say your row 1, right? Your row 1 new. What it means is this is your row 1, but all these things are rows, 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 and columns, columns, columns. So to get a new row now, your row 1 new, the formula you have to do to get your row 1 new is that you have to bring your row 1 old divided by your what? By your by divided by your key elements, which is what? 3, right? Which is your key element, right? So that is how to get your row 1 new. Therefore, your row 1 new, to get it will now be what? Equals to, what's your row 1 old? This is your row 1 old. That is your old row, right? So 8 divided by 3, right, is 8 all over 3. For this, we are using fractions. There's no point where you have to use decimals here. So 8 all over 3. Then the next value is 2. 2 divided by 3 is what? 2 all over 3. The next value is 3. 3 divided by 3 is what? 1. The next value is 0, right, which is 0. 0 divided by 3 is still what? 0, right? And then the next one is 1. 1 divided by 3 is 1 over 3. 0 divided by 3 is 0. 0 divided by 3 is 1, 0. You don't include your minimum ratio. So that is, you have gotten your row 1 new. Now this row that you got in now, your row 1 new, right? That is your new row, right? It's also called your what? Your master row. You use this master row, right, as a basis for the rest of the other rows. Let me show you what I mean. So you now go to compute for the rest of the rows. You have computed for your row 1 new. Let's compute for the new rows of the others. So your row 2 new, will now be what? Will now be your what? Your row 1, your row 2 old, right, minus what? Minus, you now look at your key column. The next value that corresponds with your x2, which is your row 2, this is your row 2, right? The next value, right, the value that corresponds at the key column is what? 2. So it will be minus 2, open bracket, right, open bracket, row 1 old, right? Okay, so you have constructed the formula to get your new row 2. So the next one will now become your what? Your row 3, right? Row 3 new. To get your row 3 new, the formula is what? Your row 3 old, right, minus your what? You now go to your row 3. What value is at the key column? Is 2 bar. So you now say 2, then row 1, what? Row 1 new. So it's going to be row 1 new. Yet so it's going to be row 1 new, right? Okay. So you see why I said it is your master row, because you use this row in the computation of the other rows. Mind you, you can also indicate here as your what? Row 1, row 2, and row 3, so that you will not forget, right? Okay. So having done that, you start applying the formula. So for your row 2 new, we are going to pick our row 2 old. So the first value for your row 2 old is what? Is 10. Right? So 10 minus 2, and then your row 1 old, your row 1 new rather, you're going to say 10 minus 2. The first value for your row 1 is what? 8 all over 3, right? Then that is for 1. You come to the second again. They said this, if you apply a formula, row 2 old. So after 10 is 0, right? So you see 0 minus what? 2. 0 minus 2, and then you put 2 all over 3, right? So as you are going to the second value, you're also pushing to the second value based on the row 1 new. So first 8 all over 3, next one 2 all over 3, put your equal to, and then for the next one is what? 2. 2 minus 2, and then the next one for here is what? 1, right? Then the next one is what? 5. 5 minus what? 5 minus 2, right? 5 minus 2. You are just applying the formula, and you put your 0 here, equals to, equals to. Then the next one is what? 0 minus 2, right? 0 minus 2. And then next one is 1 over 3, equals to. The next one is what? 1 minus 2. Then the next one is what? 0, to be equals to what? And then the next one is 0 minus 2 to be 0. So you do the same thing, right? You just apply the formula. You pick from the old row, right? And then these two, and then your row 1, you pick a value. For the first, you go to the first, the second will go to the second, the third will go to the third. That's how you do it, right? Does that make sense? Now, you are going to solve this. You are going to solve this value. Now, applying the same thing to this, right? You go, they said, to get your row 3 new, you have to look at your row 3 old. This is, the first value here is 15. So 15 minus 2, open bracket, 8 all over 3, equals to, then the next value is what? 3 minus 2, open bracket, 2 all over 3, equals to, then the next one is what? 2 minus 2, open bracket, what? 1. The next one is what? 4. 4 minus 2, 4 minus 2, right? 4 minus 2, open bracket, 0. The next one is what? 0 minus 2, open bracket, what? 1 all over 3. Then the next one is what? 0 again. 0 minus 2, open bracket, 0, equals to, and the last one is what? 0 minus, no, last one is 1. This one. 1 minus 2, open bracket, 0, equals to this. So you now do your normal computation with your calculator. So when you do your computation, these are the values that you will get, right? These are the values you get. So having done this, you now go for your what? For your improved solution, right? So which is your step 5, right? Improved solution. Improved solution, right? Okay. So you bring down the same table. So first of all, you say profit per unit, which is your what? Your CB column, right? Let's do a straight line for that. Let's bring this down. So profit per unit, which is your CB, right? And then the next one will be your variables in basic. Variables in basic. Bring it down. The next one will be your solution values. Bring it down, right? And then x1, just bring down all your values: x1, x2, x3, x1, x2, x3, and then your minimum ratio. Make sure you are able to tell the difference between your x1, your x2, your x and your s, right? Able to tell, right? So your s represent the decision variables, right? This your x1 are just slack variables. Okay, so now with this thing we have now, remember I told you that for the beginning here will be 0 and 0. Now after you have solved for the first and you have now determined that your x2 is your key column, the next thing you are going to do is you are going to bring down this cj value. This cj value will now form the value here, right? So now we have been able to find your x2 as your key column. So that will now become your incoming row. So you bring your 5. Your 5 will be here. Then the rest will be what? 0 and 0. Does that make sense? So as you keep going, the more each of the rows keep coming in. That's how you keep bringing their values, their CB values. Does that make sense? Okay. So you bring down your 5, then the rest will be 0 because why? That is your key column and that is the incoming what? Row. So your variables in basic now. Remember I told you that this key column is now what is going to replace this row. The value of this key column will replace this particular row. Why is it replacing? Because that is a key row, so it's replacing it. So x2, you now put your x2 here, right? Then you now come here. Mind you, this row 1 new represents your x2, which is your key column. So x2 will now be what? First of all, 8 all over 3. This is the 8 all over 3 here, and then 2 all over 3, and then 1, and then 0, and then 1 all over 3, and then 0, 0. Right? Just like how we did. You leave your minimum ratio empty. So for the next, which is your second row now, right? You are going to look at this your row 2 new. I don't know if you understand. So you have discovered, you have solved for a new row, a row 2 new. You're first of all going to bring your 14. The reason why we are not replacing it here because as we move on subsequently, as we bring in more incoming rows, we'll keep replacing it. But for now, it's only one incoming row that we have. So now you come down here, right? You come to this point, and then this is the value for your row 2 new. So you put your x2. Here will be x2. Why? Because we have only brought in a new, we have replaced this column with this row. So the rest of the other things will kind of remain. This x2 would remain, this x3 would remain. We only replace this x1. So you're going to bring your x2, and then you bring the new values, 14 all over 3, then minus 4 all over 3, then 0, 5, minus 2 all over 3, 1, and 0. Same thing for your x3, right? Your x3 remains x3. So the next thing next is that your x3 value is this, which is your row 3, your third row. The new value for the third row is now what? 29 all over 3, 5 all over 3, 0, 4, minus 2 all over 3, then 0 and 1. Right? Okay. So, okay. So, you are now going to find for your z. You're now going to find for your zj value and your cj minus zg. So for every table you do, for every of this improved solution you do, you find your z value, your zj value, and your cj minus zg values, right? So applying the same formula for your z and your zj that we did earlier, you're now going to find, you see, find what? Z. And how do we find Z? Mind you, our Z, the formula is what? Basic what? Basic variables coefficient, right? Times what? Times your basic variable values. Just like how I said the first time. So this will be equals to what? Now from this table now, right? Our basic coefficient, our basic variables coefficient is now 5. It's no longer 0 and 0 and 0. It's now 5. So you are going to see 5. Let me fold this paper so that you'll be able to see. So you are now going to see 5, which is what? The basic variable coefficient. 5 times what? 5 times 8 all over 3, right? Just like how we did for the first. 5 times 8 all over 3 plus what? 0 times 14 all over 3. 0 times 14 all over 3 plus 0 times 29 all over 3, right? And that will give you what? So we all know that 0 times 0 times anything is 0, 0 times anything is 0. So we are bothered with 5, right? Open bracket, 8 all over 3. That will give you what? 40 all over 3. Wait, 5, right? Open bracket, 8 all over 3, right? Close your bracket. 5 open bracket, 8 all over 3, close bracket, right? 40 all over 3. So I was just trying to confirm. So 40 all over 3, that's your Z value. So right, you come here, you write your Z is equals to 40 all over 3. Then to now get your ZG, right? Mind you, I told you our formula for ZG is what? Basic variable coefficient. Basic variable coefficient times your what? Your joint column of what? Of your what? Of data matrix. Of data matrix. Right? Okay. So, first of all, your ZG1 is equals to what? Now we said your basic variable coefficient, which is 5 bar. This value is here. So you see 5 times, this is your joint column. 5 2 all over 3. 5 2 all over 3, right? Plus 0 minus 4 all over 3. So this times this times this times this for the first. Plus 0 times 5 all over 3, right? So you go to your ZJ2 and you say 5 times this. So you no longer be on this, it will be on x2. So you see 5 times what? 1 plus what? 0 times 0 plus 0 bracket 0, right? You now go to your ZJ3, right? And equals to what? You now go to x3, 5 0 plus, right? Plus 5 plus what? 5 times 0, 0 times 5. Do you understand? 0 times 5 plus 0 and 4, right? Okay. Now for the first one, we only did for 3 ZJs. This is not going to be the case because why? You can still go further and do for the rest of the X, right? However, we will not go further for this because it's still pointless because everything here is 0, right? It's only this 5, and this 5 is also pairing with 0. So the answer we all know that is 0. But for the next one, which we'll do, and I'll show you how that we have to go more of ZJs, because if the ZJ can produce a result, we go for it. But however, now we all know that the answer will be 0. So we stop there. Put that equals to, put that equals to. So here we already know that these ones are 0 already. So we know 5, this will give you 10 all over 3. And we know these ones are 0 already. So this will give you 5. Why for this? We know everything here is 0 because 5 times 0, so everything here is 0. So we are going to say, right? Okay. So now our ZJ value will now be what? 10 all over 3. For x2 will be what? 5. Here will be 0. Y for this column. Okay. Now for this x1 column now, we all know that this columns is going to be 0 because everything here is 0. But for this column, it's not going to be 0. So we work for it. We go ZJ4 will be equals to 5. 1 all over 3. This 5 times this 1 over 3 plus what? 0 minus 2 all over 3 plus 0 minus 2 all over 3, right? So the answer here will now be what? 5 all over 3 because this rest of the zeros are pointless. So 5 times 1, 5, 5. Then 5 all over 3. So 5 all over 3. Then the rest of the things are 0. Now, assuming there were values that could produce a result here that we know, we can go for the mod ZG, but there's none. So we just, put it as 0 because we know. You can try that to confirm. So now, for your CJ, now, if you remember what I told you about what CJ value means, I said CJ values are simply what? Those values in your objective function, right? And the values are 3, 5, and what? 4. These are your CJ values. So, to get it now, you are now going to say CJ minus ZJ, let's say 1, this will be equals to what? You now pick your CJ1, which is what? 3 minus your what? Your ZJ. right? So 3 minus 10 all over 3, right? Then for your Cj minus your Zj, 2, you now pick your 5. You see 5 minus your what? 5 minus your what? Minus your Zg2, which is what? 5 minus 5, right? And then your Cj minus your Zj3 will now be what? 4 minus your what? 4 minus your 0, right? So the rest of the Cj values are 0, because that's where the objective function ends. So the rest are what? 0. So 3 minus 10 all over 3. 3 minus 10 all over 3 gives you what? Minus 1 over 3. So you put your minus 1 all over 3. And then your 5 minus 5. So just put your minus 1 all over 3. 5 minus 5 is 0, which is 0 here too. And then 4 minus 0 is what? 4, which is 4 here. Right? So I told you that the rest of the value are what? 0. So if the rest of the value are 0, if Cj is 0, 0 minus 5 over 3 gives you minus 5 all over 3. Here will be 0 and 0. Does that make sense? Okay. Now this column is very important because it's the column, this row is very important because it's the row that will help you to determine whether you have reached the optimal solution. The moment you reach your optimal solution is the moment you stop solving. Right? And how do you know you have reached it? When the value, when all the values here are what? Greater. When they are 0 or they are less than 0. So long as a value here is greater than 0, right? That means our optimal solution has not been met. So from here now, you can tell that our optimal solution has not been met because why? There's a value like 4, which is greater than what? 0. So you now say, you repeat the same thing that was stated here. From the table above, the values are Cj minus Zj rho is equals to 0. Thus, the optimal solution has not been met. You repeat the same thing here. Then, if you have repeated that, you now say, at the Cj minus Zj rho, right, the highest possible, the highest positive number is what? 4. So if the highest positive number is 4, thus your x3 becomes your what? Your x3 becomes your what? Your key column. So since we have not reached the optimal solution, we have to redo this our process. We have to redo these processes back again. So I'm certain that this whole thing is very much familiar to you because we have done something like this in production management. So it becomes the key column, right? So you now identify this as your key column or your pivot column. Now this one will now become your incoming what? Your incoming what? Your incoming row. So that becomes your key column. Then after you discover what that is your key column, you now do the same thing, right, that you have done here. You now feed this your minimum ratio. So now 8 all over 3 divided by 0. You not pay any reference to this. Okay, so for the first row to now fill your minimum ratio after you have determined what your key column is. Now for this row that just came in, you keep it a dash. Always remember the row that just came in, there's no need to fill anything in the minimum ratio. You let it be, right? For the second one now, this is 14 all over 3. So having determined what our key column is, what are we now going to divide it by? From the knowledge I told you here, you are going to look at the values that correspond from the key column. So the value that is at the key column, that is at the row of 14 over 3 is what? 5. So we are going to say 14 all over 3 divided by 5, right? Same thing for here, it will be 29 all over 3 divided by what? 4. Right? So when you do that, you discover that this will give you the lowest number. This will now become your what? Your key row. So you see S2 will be equals to your what? Your key row, right? Your key row, right? And then your key element will now be what? the intersection. So KC and KR is intersected at what? 5. So basically now you still now repeat the same iteration. You now go for your second iteration. This will now be your iteration, right? And then you now do the same thing that we have done.